Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's IMPLAN webinar. It is the top of the hour here. We'll give it just another minute or two to allow folks to keep joining us before we get started. Welcome, everybody, to today's IMPLAN webinar, Hurricanes, Floods, and Beyond, Quantifying the Economic Impacts of Natural Disasters. In today's webinar, we will discuss the impacts of natural disasters on regional economies, from the immediate responses pre and post-disaster, all the way up to the recovery process afterwards. We will explore the quantifiable financial risk associated with disasters and the use of IMPLAN to strategize for risk mitigation. So I am Michael Nealy. I'm a senior education services specialist working on IMPLAN's education services team. And joining me today to help lead the presentation is Dr. Candi Clouse, who is IMPLAN's Vice President of Customer Success and Education Services. Just a quick housekeeping item here. We obviously encourage all of the engagement we can get, and we love getting questions from everybody, but today's presentation will likely take close to the full 45-minute time slot that we've allotted. So we ask that if you do have a question related to today's topic, to please utilize the question box in GoToWebinar. Our team will do our best to monitor the question box throughout the presentation and get you the answers you need. If you think you might want to ask a question, just make sure that you have this control panel here on this screen open by hitting the orange arrow up at the top of the control panel. And at the conclusion of the presentation, we will do our best to answer as many questions live as we can. If we do not get the chance to answer your question within our allotted time frame, we will personally follow up with everyone to provide a response. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass the mic off to Dr. Clouse to get us started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. What are we going to learn today? Well, we are going to look at the types of disasters that can be modeled inside of the IMPLAN application. These are both human-made disasters and natural disasters. Additionally, we're going to look at an example. What are the economic impacts of these disasters? How we plan and mitigate risk, what that short-term initial impact is, and the long-term building back as well. And then finally, we're going to finish up. Michael's going to lead us through an example. So what are these disasters that affect the economy? Very simply, a disaster is defined by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. We have not only the onset of the disaster that can come quickly or slowly over time, as in a drought, and then we can look at the fact that these effects can be very immediate and very localized, or extremely widespread and lasting very long times. First off, what is the difference between human and natural disasters? Well, human-made disasters are those made by humans. So think of things like crime, arson, civil disorder, acts of terrorism, any kind of war, biological and chemical threats, cyber attacks, infrastructure failures, etc. Contrary to that, we have the natural disasters. This is something that occurs naturally. And there's five phenomenon that these fall into. The geophysical, which is something originating from the earth, like an earthquake, landslide, volcano. Hydrological, something about water, floods, things like that. Climatological, something about the climate, like a drought or a wildfire. Meteorological, relating to weather, such as a hurricane, such as tornadoes. And finally, biological, something caused from exposure to living organisms and some kind of toxins or disease that they may carry, something like an epidemic or a plague that's caused by an insect or various animal. Man-made and technological hazards are events that are caused by humans, basically, and natural disasters are those that are caused outside of human control. So how do we look at the economic impacts of these natural disasters? We look at these in terms of three different steps. First, there's the preparation phase, and this is really where planning and mitigating risk is happening. The second phase is the response. What happens in that short term while the event is happening? And then finally, we have the recovery effort. This is the building back after something has occurred. Diving into each of these separately, first off, planning and mitigating risk. What happens when we are trying to plan? Well, places that are used to having disasters that occur there, such as those that live in popular hurricane locations, they may have an evacuation plan to get out of town as soon as they can. However, not everyone can evacuate, and those with the highest incomes are most likely to leave. There's also a lot of preparation that goes into preparing the house or the business physical structure for the storm, making sure that things are boarded up, that things are walled off as necessary. And then there's increased spending that happens at grocery and household stores for those that are staying as they stock up on necessities that will get them through the storm. For businesses, some of the same things, but they also have to know disaster risks and analyze the potential problems that could affect their business operations. So they have usually emergency business plans in an effort to protect their data and their business assets as well. Important for them to review insurance policies and making sure they have everything up to standard to ensure that they are covered in the event of some kind of a happening. They may need to switch from on-site servers to something that's cloud-based. Perhaps they need to increase insurance coverage or fortify their physical structure. Finally, we have what the government does in terms of this planning and mitigation phase. There are hazard mitigation plans to determine risks from various events across the country. And there are various federal programs and grants to fund mitigation efforts to prevent massive losses from anything happening. Government will also implement structural and non-structural changes that will hopefully minimize the effects of any disaster. And again, they can begin disaster preparedness initiatives and emergency plans and get all of that out to the public and to the business community. So this could be something as simple as funding a public service announcement on a local radio station about household preparedness, everything to building up walls that will keep water from entering certain areas of town. FEMA is a fantastic resource for a lot of this information. They have a resilience analysis planning tool that uses GIS mapping, allowing you to visualize potential challenges to community resilience. And then they also have the HAZAS program, which is managed by their Natural Hazard Risk Assessment Program. And this is looking at tools and data for estimating the risks to certain regions from various events. And it will give physical damage estimates to various kinds of buildings and the infrastructure around the area. This kind of resource can also be used for prioritizing risk, future planning, response planning, and general education to the community. So, beyond planning, what happens in the short term? That initial impact when something happens. There's disruption of typical business operations. Not all businesses can stay open or are safely allowed to stay open. There's changes in government service. While there might not be the normal recycling pickup, there's shifts in how government responds and throws additional resources in the direction to ensure safety for all in the area. And generally, we see some evacuations. So, spending of certain households will leave the region as they are not in region spending their normal money on things like groceries and entertainment. They instead take that spending and it leaves the region. While generally we'll see a chunk of their spending does stay in region on things like rent and car payments and insurance and things like that, a good portion of that money does leave the region as they need to take care of their family while they are out of the region. After the disaster, we might have some loss of utilities. Things like the water system, waste disposal, electricity, natural gas, often interrupted by acts like this. Transportation networks, roads, rail, air, these can all be closed because of unsafe situations within that region. And the distribution of supplies can also be halted because the access is no longer available. Emergency services will bring in temporary workers. When you think of things like the Red Cross coming in, helping out those residents that need additional places to stay, additional food, things like that. And in rare circumstances, some evacuees may never be able to return. That when there is complete devastation of their residence, they may never come back to the region. Long term, we start building back. We see increases in construction, workforce recovery programs, providing funding for labor development to meet all of those needs, businesses shifting and potentially relocating to avoid the risk. And again, those residents, some of them permanently relocating, resulting in a change in overall household income for that region. With that, I'm going to switch everything over to Michael, who's going to walk us through an example of Hurricane Beryl.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Candy. Whoops. Make sure I have my sharing permissions together and great. All right. So like Candy said, now we're going to go through a very, very quick example that demonstrates how IMPLAN can be used to estimate the economic impacts from hurricanes. And we're going to use Hurricane Beryl in the state of Texas as our focus here. For those of you who do not know, Hurricane Beryl was a Category 1 hurricane that struck Matagorda Bay, Texas on July 8th of this year. This was one of the top 3 wind events to occur in Houston in recent decades, as Beryl's eye passed through the Houston metro area with a strong, sustained wind force peaking at 92 miles per hour. To this point, we know that Beryl killed at least 26 people and knocked out power to over 2.2 million residents. Hurricane Beryl is estimated to have caused anywhere between 28 and $32 billion in damages on the national level. So pretty devastating wind force there. And thinking about how we can bridge this information that we know about Hurricane Beryl, this traumatic weather event, into some short-term impacts that can be modeled in IMPLAN and what we need to consider when modeling for temporary business interruptions in IMPLAN. So we have a few questions here to keep in mind. So what regions are going to be impacted? Like I said earlier, we're going to focus on the state of Texas for this one. But then we also need to consider what is that region's biggest industry, or the group of the region's biggest industries. And of those industries, which are going to be the most susceptible to interruptions from a natural disaster such as Hurricane Beryl. And we can use that to inform how we would set up a project on the IMPLAN side. Being that we probably still don't have a lot of great information as to more accurate regional accounts of the actual damage that was done uh, during Hurricane Beryl in Texas, being that it still was only about 4 months ago, we can utilize some of IMPLAN's available resources to help generate, again, some high level estimates of some potential short-term impacts from this weather event. So we'll focus here on the city of Houston. So Houston is the largest city in urban area on the Gulf Coast, and it was pretty dramatically affected by Hurricane Beryl. What we'll do here throughout this presentation is utilize the industry data that's available in IMPLAN's data library to help us identify which types of major businesses in the Houston area could have or were impacted as a result of this hurricane. Using this industry data, we could then model the impact of any potential slowed production on the state of Texas. So we remember back to what Candi discussed as far as those immediate and short-term responses to natural disasters. Business production dipping is one of those big potential short-term impacts that can have a major effect on regional economies. So with that, we're going to jump into IMPLAN real quick. And like I said, we're going to utilize the industry data that can be found in IMPLAN. And we'll come back to this visualization here in a second. The first thing I want to highlight is IMPLAN's CEW data on the county or at the county level for Harris County. So the Census of Employment and Wage, or CEW, data found in IMPLAN's data library is sourced from the Bureau of Labor Statistics with added imputed values for non-disclosures. So what this is showing us here in this table is the employment and number of establishments by various NAICS codes in Harris County, Texas. And again, this is down to the 6-digit NAICS level. And we built this from scratch here. And this is just going to, again, show us, we can sort here by the largest employment and NAICS. So we can see up top here, the largest wage and salary employment NAICS code would be for elementary and secondary schools, with over 127,000 wage and salary employees in Harris County in 2022. Additionally, we could use this data to help inform us on the number of establishments that are reported in each NAICS code for Harris County back in 2022. So naturally, private households would be near the top of this, but we also have things like the offices of physicians or services for elderly and persons with disabilities. We get into some things like full service and limited service restaurants. I'll zoom in just a bit. And these could be potential sectors that are slowed to a halt as a result of a natural disaster like Hurricane Beryl. Folks will likely be sheltering in place, if not evacuating the region altogether. So full service restaurants and limited service restaurants are going to be potentially without the labor force necessary to operate. And on top of that, folks might not even be going out to restaurants. So these are two potential industries that could be impacted as a result of Hurricane Beryl. Now, again, you can utilize this data to help inform how you would want to structure a project in IMPLAN, but as you can tell, there are various industries that have a strong presence in Harris County, Texas. So this could get complicated in a hurry. For the sake of today's example, we're going to keep it a little bit more simple and utilize the industry level data for IMPLAN's industry scheme. So I've created another look here that we saw just a moment ago. And this is identifying the top 10 industries in output per day. So what we're doing is taking their 2022 nominal output values for all industries in Harris County in 2022 and dividing that by the number of days in a year. And we're displaying it graphically as the top 10 industries. I'll explore from this look to give you a little bit more information on how this was configured. So again, taking a peek at our filter window, we're just looking at Harris County, Texas, looking at our data year 2022, and again, utilizing dollar year 2022 so that we're assessing nominal values. Down here in our data window, you can see, very simply put, what we're doing is looking at all industries in Harris County, their total output unadjusted for inflation in 2022, and dividing this. So I created a custom calculated column, which very simply, if we take a look at this column, is looking at that total output per year and dividing it by the number of days in a year. So 365, and that can give us, again, an estimate of the number of, or the amount of output that could be potentially lost per day if these industries were to stop operating as the result of a natural disaster. Thinking about the actual region that we're analyzing here, it's not that surprising that we see industries such as oil and gas extraction, petroleum refineries, and petrochemical manufacturing near the top, with some sizable per day production values. Thinking back to what Candi said earlier, though, about the disruptions that might be typical during a hurricane, down here in number 9, we also see electric power transmission and distribution. And what that's showing us is that per day of electrical utilities being unavailable, which we know is the case for Hurricane Beryl, there was over 2.2 million folks without power, that we could lose about $41 million of production for each day that this would be essentially assuming that all of their customers are without power, but nonetheless, still quite a sizable impact if transmission and distribution businesses were not able to operate in the region for, again, at this point, just a single day. So what we can do is translate this into inputs for an IMPLAN project back on the input-output side of IMPLAN's application. So again, I just spoke quickly about those 4 industries that could potentially be impacted, some major players in the Harris County economy, oil and gas extraction, petroleum refineries, petrochemical manufacturing, and those electric power transmission and distribution businesses. And what we're going to model is 1 day of lost production. So exactly that data we just referred to back in IMPLAN's data library. We'll analyze this lost production specifically in Harris County, but then we'll also link the rest of Texas in our analysis utilizing the multi-regional input-output functionality. And what that's going to do is show us how these slowed production levels in Harris County can potentially impact the rest of Texas. We'll set this up using a multi-industry contribution analysis just to make sure we're being on the more conservative end with our estimates of the effects from these businesses not being able to operate for a day. So not overestimating the impacts to oil and gas extraction, petroleum refineries, petrochemical manufacturers, or electric power transmission and distribution businesses. Okay, so again, this is what our events will look like. In this column on the far left, we have the industry that's impacted that we talked about. Our event type, like I said, is going to be industry contribution analysis for each of those industries with their associated industry code or specification in this 3rd column. And then on the far right, you have the event value that I'm going to model in this example. As you can see, all of these values are negative to, again, represent a loss of industry production for 1 day. So oil and gas extraction will lose about $240 million per day of their contribution. Petroleum refineries just over or just under 181 million. Petrochemical manufacturers are 3rd on that list overall with about $110 million of output per day. And then we jump down that line a little bit here just to assess the electric power transmission and distribution, which would have a loss of about $41 million per day. Okay, so with that, we'll jump back into IMPLAN here, and I will pull up the impacts page of this project that I've already gone and run. Like I said, we have 4 separate industry contribution analysis events set up for those 4 target industries that we want to assess being closed for 1 day. Our event values are going to be those per day of output estimates that we pulled by industry from data library. Our region setup is as follows. So what we're going to do is place each of those events, each of those industry contribution analysis events into the Harris County, Texas region, utilizing our most recently available 2022 data year and 2022 dollar year. And the reason we're using 2022 dollar year is because, again, remember those values we were looking back at in data library were nominal values. So we want to make sure that's reflected in the group where we place these events. Notice up at the top of this group, again, we also have our industry contribution analysis icon, which is indicating to us that we have these ICA events in our groups. So our indirect and induced effects to these 4 target industries will be restricted in Harris County, Texas. However, our second group is the rest of, so to speak, Harris County, or excuse me, the rest of Texas, less Harris County. So thinking about Texas as a jigsaw puzzle, we've pulled Harris County out as its own individual region, and then we're putting the rest of that puzzle in this rest of region, which will utilize these same data and dollar year. And then we're linking these 2 groups via MRIO so that we can see those interregional spillover effects from this loss of industry production in Harris County, Texas, on the surrounding counties in Texas. If we jump into our results here, you can see, because we ran negative values, our estimated economic indicators are also negative. So from these 4 businesses slowing operations for even a single day, we see over $623 million of direct lost output. Additionally, in our total contribution to GDP, we see a loss of about $471 million, so some sizable impacts here. And in addition to our economic indicators, we can also see the associated lost potential tax revenue. So our state revenue, which I'll identify here, is about $17 million. So we're losing about $17 million of government tax revenue to the state of Texas. Again, and this is only looking at 1 potential day of lost production. It's possible that some of these businesses, of the 4 industries we identified, are closed for multiple days. So this could be even larger if we were to factor in those things. And here I've pulled those values into this slide within the presentation and looking at the overall target industry short-term impact. So to assess the economic impact of the business shutdowns in Houston, Texas because of Hurricane Beryl, we singled out these 4 key regional industries to analyze in our project, with the general assumption being that each of the industries would be unable to operate for a single day in the Houston area. The lost economic activity in the entire state of Texas could potentially be over $941 million of total output or total economic impact, and $471 million, just under $471 million of contribution to the gross domestic product for the state of Texas. In addition to output and value added, this would also affect roughly 1,156 employees, reducing their labor income by about $158 million. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking when you look at these employment results. That's a very, very high multiplier. And you would be absolutely correct. These are relatively high multipliers, but the reason that we're seeing high employment effect multiplier here is because these directly impacted industries are very, very productive per worker. So again, in order to generate $623 million roughly of direct output loss, it would only cost us about 130 jobs. So again, that's a very, very high output per worker ratio, which all else equal will lead to some pretty high employment multipliers. So you can see in our indirect and induced output results that the output is smaller in magnitude than the direct, but the indirect and induced employment is sizably larger than the direct. So that's what's leading to that very, very high multiplier here. When we look at our value added and our employment multipliers, or our output, multipliers, they are not nearly as high. Okay, so some additional considerations here about what we just did. Of course, the example we just considered only looked at some of the very, very, very quick and high level potential economic impacts of a hurricane. It was not particularly nuanced. This also only considered the lost industry production that could be associated with potential business interruptions from Hurricane Beryl. For one thing, naturally, we only analyzed a select number of industries. If you think back to the visualization we took a peek at for the CEW data and data library, there are various different major players as far as employment and number of establishments that could be affected as a result of business interruptions from a natural disaster. And I say that to be, again, clear that the impacts from these interruptions was likely far more widespread than what we considered for these 4 industries alone. Additionally, Candi went through a ton of additional considerations for both pre-disaster and post-disaster impacts, such as households, business or government planning, households evacuating the region. None of that was considered, again, just in the name of keeping this as simple as possible. Additionally, we only modeled the negative economic effects here. So these business production losses, it was modeled as a negative contribution analysis. So we did not analyze any of those long-term recovery efforts, which are naturally ongoing, as those tend to be a positive for regional economies. So we're really only looking at one side of this with the project that I set up. And those construction efforts, as the region and the economy as a whole and their businesses within the economy repair damages done by the natural disaster, will have some offsetting positive effects. All right, so we got through that a little bit quicker than we anticipated, which is a good thing. Again, like I said earlier, if you have questions, I know a few of them have been flying in as we went through the presentation. Feel free to post those in the questions box. Even if we do end up running out of time, we will do our best to answer them now. If not, we will follow up with you after the conclusion of the webinar. Few additional items to note here. If you would like to dig deeper into IMPLAN's new application, you can always schedule a live personalized demo by visiting implan.com/demo. On a demo, our team can show you all the data inside the application, run through an analysis specific to your analytical interest, and show you all of the results populated by IMPLAN. To schedule yours, visit implan.com/demo again, or email sales@implan.com. Additionally, IMPLAN provides a 24/7 support resource at support.implan.com. And it looks like we have an additional @ in there. This is support dot, not support dot at implan.com. On support.implan.com, you can find recordings of past webinars that we've done, along with registration for upcoming sessions, as well as an entirely revamped knowledge-based support site that can provide you a ton of useful information, such as more information on data library or the CEW data you can find in data library. All right, so with that, again, I know we have a few questions that have rolled in. So we have a question here on how are these industries, or how were these industries identified? Do you have to make certain assumptions for that? And the answer is, of course, yes. So we didn't, in this example, have a ton of information to go off of as far as how we could analyze this type of economic effect in IMPLAN. So what we did is we utilized some of, again, the available resources to, again, make some very, very high level potential economic impacts. So what we did is identified these top industries by output per day, assuming that they are big regional businesses, because naturally they are relative to other businesses in the area, and pulled out a few that we either knew or wanted to assume could have slowed production as a result of the impacts from Hurricane Beryl. Another question kind of related to this, how should I decide how many industries to include in the analysis, i.e. top 5, top 10, etc.? And that's a great question. The answer to that is really just what you want to focus on. I tried to make it as clear as possible that this is just a very, very high level analysis. But if you want to utilize all 10 of these industries, you certainly could. It's all up to the assumptions that you are comfortable making as an analyst. Because we know, thinking back to the CEW data visualization, that there are thousands of establishments and tons of employees that could potentially be impacted. So as better data is made more available to you, I would utilize that to leverage, in addition to IMPLAN's available industry level data and the CEW data, to inform how you go about choosing the number or the sector industries to include in this part of the analysis. But again, there are other aspects that we can hit here as far as the economic effects from natural disasters. Again, the big one being this example only looked at the negatives associated from lost industry production, whereas the damages to businesses and to households, that's going to require funds to be spent on maintenance and repair construction, on new construction to build the economy back up. So you would really want to consider all of those things that Candi went through, from the pre-disaster to the short-term initial impact to the post long-term recovery efforts as well. Okay, so another question, should you have the dollar year set to 2022? And that's a great question. So what I'll do is just clarify exactly what's being asked here. When we were on the impacts page, we utilized the 2022 dollar year because that reflected the year of our data inputs, right? So thinking back to data library, I'll pull this look back up here in the top 10 industries in output per day. If we open up this filter window, you can see our dollar year was set to 2022, which is the same as our data year, meaning that essentially no inflationary values were applied here. Now, the reason why on the results end, I pulled these values in 2024 dollar year is because this hurricane happened in 2024. So we would want to make sure that we're accounting for the differences in inflation from 2022 to 2024. So great question there.
All right, Michael, our next question is, why not also model the impact of the hurricane on the rest of Texas and use MRIO to show the impact of it to Harris as well?
Yeah, and that's a great question here. And I think that just comes back down to, like I've said a few times, that just trying to keep this analysis very simple. As our viewer has rightly noted, there was there were several regions. It wasn't just Harris County or just Houston that were impacted as a result of Hurricane Beryl. So a more robust analysis will probably include each of the regions that was individually impacted as a result of this natural disaster with regional specific values instead of just accounting for Harris County. But what we're doing here is really just trying to demonstrate the possibilities. So you could expand on this analysis and get as detailed as you are comfortable getting, and the data available to you will allow you.
Awesome. All right, a question on labor income in Houston. Is the assumption that all the income included salaried wages would be affected?
Yes, that is correct. So when we're thinking about labor income, first and foremost here, these labor income values will include not only wage and salary workers earning income, this will also include proprietor income. And the same goes for employment. This includes both wage and salary employees and proprietor employees. So when we're thinking about wage and salary workers, they earn employee compensation, which is a fully loaded payroll value that would include both their wages and salary income, as well as any supplements to their wages and salaries. So great question.
All
We
right,
have
we have a
another
couple questions.
question.
Oh,
Yeah, I saw
I'm
one come in
sorry.
here that I want to take. Yeah, so can you show us where to find the specific per day values? Great question. We showed that a bit earlier. Essentially what I did, again, to build this graph here, whoops, close this out, come back. What we did was we utilized an industry data explorer. So in an industry data explorer, if I explore from here, again, this is what it took to build that visualization. I'll try to clear up as much screen space as I can, is we selected some dimensions and some measures. So we included our county as Harris County, and we filtered on that in our filter window. We included all industries, and we can see that in our data window as a column for industry. And additionally, we included a column for output. So these are the values that we're relying on from IMPLAN's underlying data. Now, in order to generate that per day value, that's not something that IMPLAN has straight out of the box, but it's very simple to create these per day estimates by adding a custom calculated column. So if we look at this calculation, all I simply did was looked at the market data dot output to refer to that industry level output and divided it by the number of days per year and gave it the name output per day annual average. So that's what we use for our inputs to the model.
Excellent. All right, next question. How can IMPLAN be used in a damage prevention framework? Can we use it to examine trade-offs between adaptation strategies now versus unmitigated damages and reconstruction efforts in the future? Do you want to take that or you want me to answer that one, Michael?
Yeah, Candi, you take a crack at that one if you don't mind.
Absolutely. No, not at all. One of the great things about IMPLAN is how much you can customize things on that impact screen. So Michael ran 4 different events, all negatives. We could look at both the positives and the negatives and look at basically what that difference would be versus when we think about building up a region from mitigation strategies that would hope to minimize the overall effect from an event like one of these, and then look at what the costs would be if we didn't do those and make those comparisons when we look at the results. So it's really up to the analyst to decide what pieces you want to look at and how you want to examine those things.
Yeah,
And another
great.
question that's related to that, are there approaches that can be used to model other kinds of disaster impacts that were mentioned in the first part of the webinar, for example, household? Absolutely. What Michael went through was a very basic example just because we have limited time, but we can absolutely look at the changes in household income that would be within the region. We might want to specifically look at spending on certain commodities. Again, as we know, certain spending will stay in region as Rent payments and mortgage payments are usually very localized, but a bunch of that spending will leave at least in the short term, but potentially some in the long term as well as people relocate.
Yes, and I see another question that's come in here, which is very important. I know I mentioned this briefly earlier about whether or not this presentation will be available publicly. So after the conclusion of this presentation, there will be a little bit of a processing time, but after which we will upload the recording of today's webinar from our support site. If you navigate to Learning Center and then to webinars, you can find all of the recordings of past webinars. So this webinar, Hurricane Floods and Beyond, will have this registration link very shortly here. Again, after we finish up, turn into a recording of what we just covered here today.
Excellent. Well, that gets us perfectly to the end of time. I think there might be a few questions that we didn't get to answer live. We will follow up with those individuals on a case-by-case basis. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our team, support@implan.com. Thank you again, Michael Nealy, and everyone have a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, Candy. Everybody have a great weekend. Thanks for joining us.